will grow. So let us start then. Welcome to our public lecture and from the Department of Philosophy, Practical and Systematic Theology. And the public lecture is entitled Appreciating the Significance of James H. Cone. And we are very happy to welcome our colleague, Prof. Anthony Reddie, and many of you may know him in the department. A little bit of introduction. He is an extraordinary professor in the discipline of systematic theology. He's also a supervisor with us, student being our colleague Curtis Love. And some background on him, it's also in the poster there, but he is with the he completed his PhD with Professor John Hull in the University of Birmingham in education and practical theology, and currently he is the professor of Black theology and the director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture. And today he's going to be sharing about his latest publication on James H. Cone and unpacking that and giving us a summary of that publication. So we warmly welcome you, Prof. Anthony, and thank you. As you said, you were on sabbatical. Thank you for making time. And colleagues, we leave after his presentation, we leave it open, and please interact and ask questions, and welcome. And so it's over to you. I think you have about maybe 45 minutes if you would like to share, or less or more. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So it's great to have this opportunity to come and share with you, as I said.
How we feel about disciplinary cases, that they are not actually being dealt with. So I think, I don't know.
Hello?
Well, I'm sorry, I think we need to mute.
Let me suggest this. Have another meeting.
Okay,
Please
sorry.
mute yourself, please. Okay, so I will try again.
Sorry.
So it's great to be with you. As has been said, I'm on sabbatical. I'm only breaking my sabbatical on 2 occasions. So on this occasion, I'm speaking with you about my work on James H. Cone, and then next week I'm giving a lecture in London that I had agreed to do about 2 years ago, and so it would be bad form, I guess, not to do it now. But what I want to do really is just to speak about what I think are some of the key ideas that comes from James Cone that I've tried to detail in my book. The book is called An Introduction to James Cone, A Personal Exploration. And the reason for the subtitle is because I was very aware that in writing a book about James Cone, who is, I guess, an icon and the most important Black liberation theologian, is that there are so many people who could write about him in a much more personal way, people who would know him far better than I did. And so my assessment of Cone is both a scholarly one, but it's also a personal one in terms of his impact upon me. So first I want to say a couple of preliminaries before we kind of sort of get into the bulk of the lecture, which is really to look at what I think are the key ideas of Cone and why he should be read, and why I think his presence on curricula, particularly theological education, should be essential. Firstly, is that Cone was always clear that God does not do theology. Theology is human speech about God. And so one of the things that Cone was very, very clear about was that there is a relationship between the theologian and the theology they are doing. Most of the white European tradition often assumes that there's a kind of universality and objectivity to the way in which theologians talk about God, as if somehow, as they are writing, God's very self falls down from heaven, perches God's self on their shoulders, and then whispers essential truths into their ears, as if what the theologian is writing is what God is dictating. And of course, that's nonsense. The theology that God does not do theology. Theology is human speech about God. And so Cohn was always very, very clear about the significance of context and lived experience in the shaping of undertaking of doing theological work. And so one of the things I want to talk about is something of his context, and then to ask a critical question, which is in our situation now, given that our context is not the same as his, how do we continue to theologize in the spirit of Black theology without trying to reify the words of Cohn or to reify his ideas, given that his ideas come in a specific cultural milieu, i.e. the late 1960s and the Black Power movement. But I want to start with looking at Cohn's second book, A Black Theology of Liberation. And James Cohn says this about God. He says, the reality of God is presupposed in Black theology. So I guess the important thing to say about this statement is that James Cohn was in many ways quite an orthodox or conventional in his theological outlook. That whereas aspects of liberal theology, and I say aspects because obviously liberal theology is a broad theological movement, but whereas aspects of liberal theology have questioned whether God exists or if God is namely an extension of human consciousness with no independent life or existence beyond human thought, James Cohn was in no doubt that God was real. And the implications of this, hopefully I will get back to in a moment, in terms of how then do we theologize if we believe that God is a real active agent in human history. This presupposed nature of God did not lead to anti-intellectualism or to lazy or sloppy thinking. On the contrary, Cohn goes on to say the following, and this is a quote. It says, Black theology is an attempt to analyze the nature of reality, asking what we can say about the nature of God about the nature of God in view of God's self-disclosure in biblical history and the oppressed condition of Black people. If we take the question seriously, it becomes evident that there is no simple answer to it. To speak of God and God's participation in the liberation of the oppressed of the land is a risky venture in any society. But if that society is racist and also uses God language as an instrument to further the cause of human humiliation, then the task of authentic theological speech becomes even more dangerous and difficult. End of quote. There's much to unpack in this statement, because in many respects, the above this quotation contains many, if not all, of the essential ingredients to be found in Cohn's recipe for talking about God and God's nature as it applies to Black theology. For Cohn to say that God is real is to presuppose the existence of God as an active participant in the world and most crucially in human history. For Cohn, the God of the Bible is also the God of history, in that the actions of the former are consistent with those of the latter. As we will see, the key characteristic of God for James Cohn and for Black theology is that of liberation. A God of liberation is seen to be active in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Christian New Testament. A God who's the same yesterday, today, and forever, and can be known by the deeds that this God has undertaken. For Cohn, God is not merely a good idea. A good idea might well inspire people, but whether a good idea possesses the resources to empower and transform people to fight sacrificially for radical change is open to debate. So the God of Black theology is not a metaphor or an organizing principle. When exploring the social context out of which Black theologians undertake their theological work, Cohn is clear that all theology is done in a particular context and social reality. And the depth of Black suffering and oppression means that a God who is not in the business of liberating, those who are socially marginalized and oppressed, is in fact no God at all. Not only is God real, but this God is not disinterested or oblivious to the suffering of God's people. Once again, the biblical witness to God's saving acts is clear as to the character of God. Cohn writes, and I quote again, "The God in Black theology is the God of and for the oppressed, the God who continues into their view in their liberation. Any other approach is a denial of biblical revelation." End of quote. So the fact that Cohn's doctrine of God assumes God's involvement within human history obviously throws up many, many problems. And I know that within South Africa, this was and remains an acute theological challenge, which is basically this. If God is only a metaphor or an organizing principle, then one cannot expect that God to do anything in terms of being active in overturning evil and oppression and suffering. But if God is real, as Cohn asserts, then the question is, how then do we account for the oppression of marginalized and poor people in the world if God is the God of the oppressed and is on their side? This question is one that continues to be debated by Black theologians across the world. Perhaps the most trenchant challenge of this actually came in 1973 from William R. Jones in his masterful book, Is God a White Racist? Jones critiques Cohn's presumed theism. Jones argues that Black theologians have, and I quote, compounded the confusion of an already inscrutable mystery by assuming uncritically classical Western constructions of God for their proclamations concerning God's political allegiances. End of quote. Jones challenges Cohn to evidence the nature of God's allegiance to Black people as the God of the oppressed. And this still represents, as I said, one of the most telling and critical challenges that faces Black theology, and particularly those who follow in Cohn's footsteps. Certainly, it's not my place to interpret what this question would mean for post-apartheid South Africa, where the poorest of the poor remain, as I believe, in percentage terms, even poorer now than they were during the period of apartheid, which then begs the question, what is a God of liberation doing in order to transform these horrendous realities? But let me continue. So Jamal Calloway, who is a third-generation African-American Black theologian, has probably written, I would say, probably one of the best, more recent critiques looking at Cohn and William R. Jones in terms of the question of theodicy. In summary, Calloway argues that for the existence of a God who possesses the characteristics of being sovereign with the power to act in human history, one has to account for why Black people, and in brackets other marginalized people, I'm thinking particularly of Palestinians in Gaza as we speak at this moment, still suffer disproportionately. Either an active and real God can choose to change things but chooses not to do so, hence Jones's memorable phrase, is God a white racist? Or that God has no intent to identify with any particular experience of humanity, i.e. God is not the God of the oppressed, or even more startlingly, God possesses no power to intervene in human history at all. And so Calloway's article is one that looks at this continuing challenge that Cohn himself wrestled with across the whole of his life, and which Cohn addresses particularly in his 3 autobiographical works. Calloway says this, and I quote, Jones is the most intense internal critic whose rational critique led him to a Black humanist perspective, a perspective that is inherently part of the Black liberation tradition. Nevertheless, for Cohn, suffering is defeated through an acceptance of an understanding of biblical Christology, that Jesus' death and resurrection function as the decisive event for which Jones was searching. Cohn slightly rectifies this argument in his first memoir, but completely rectifies it in his second and final memoir. Cohn reduces his Christological defense of suffering in My Soul Looks Back by focusing on the faith of a people who believe both in God and liberation. And this leads me, therefore, to my first critical question about how we do theology in light of the belief, for some of us, not necessarily for all of us, that God is a real presence in the world, a real presence in human history. And I want to make, I think, three very, very quick observations about this. Firstly, it's the extent to which even those of us who say that we believe that God is real in the world, it's whether there is a sense of functional atheism, even in amongst the believers who've said that. And what I mean by that is simply this, and it's something I remember my mother saying to me many, many years ago, that if God is real, and we believe God's in the world, and we believe God is a faithful presence revealed in the minutiae of our actions as we live in the world, then here's an important question. If we really believed it, then would we behave in the way we behave, and would we do the things we do? Would our ethics be as they are if we truly believe that God was present at every moment in history, mediating alongside us in our everyday reality? The truth is, I suspect that most of us work on the basis that if God is present, then God is maybe a bit like an absentee landlord. It kind of turns up once in a while, but for the most part is absent and is not present. Because if God really was, then surely our behavior would be different. Our engagement with the other would be different. Our ethics would be different. But they are as they are because maybe many of us are working with a form of functional atheism. That's the first point. Secondly, there's a bit where Cohn talks about his engagement with the Death of God movement, which was a theological movement that really starts in largely in North America, but existed very much within the West, very much within highly developed, technocratic, capitalist countries like my own in the UK. And was this sense in which, certainly on the optimism of 1960s in the West, and the growth of economic progress in terms of post-World War II, there was a kind of optimism that said, well, maybe we've kind of outgrown God. Maybe we've gotten to the point now where human agency and our self-determination and our wizardry with science and technology is effectively answering all the questions that we once would have attributed to God in the past. And so maybe we kind of outgrown God. So it's a Death of God movement. Of course, there is the famous response from the African student. It's an apocryphal story of the African student who sort of sat in a seminar in Harvard University where some of the famous theologians like Harvey Cox are discussing that the Death of God movement, and at which point the African student says, well, that's really interesting that God has died, because back in Africa we didn't even know that God was sick. Perhaps one of the things we are seeing now with the rise of popularism and Trumpism, and in Britain, Brexit, and we have a political conservative party actually staffed mainly with black and brown people who have internalized the logics of colonialism and empire to the point whereby they're making Margaret Thatcher look like a liberal. So we have a political calibration that has moved defiantly to the right. Is that maybe the truest expression of white European or Euro-American theology is the Death of God movement. And by that I mean that maybe one of the things that Cohn's legacy tells us is that for the most part, whiteness has always functioned as if God did not exist or God had died. And therefore, because God had died and God is not present to affect any form of judgment, effectively, white power has the ability to do whatever it chooses without any consequence, because there are no consequences, because the ultimate judge, God, is not present. Maybe that's the most honest expression of white theology. In the UK, I have noted the tendency of most political powers and people in authority to side unequivocally with Israel in terms of what they're doing to Gaza at this moment in time. And effectively, what is being done, whatever one thinks about Hamas and Hezbollah, or whatever one thinks about their actions that precipitated this, I doubt there's anyone sensible who could then say that the response from Israel is proportionate. And yet it's been done with a kind of hubris that assumes that there is indeed no judgment, no comeback, no qualification that makes them want to temper their actions, because there is no ultimate judge that will ever call them to account. Maybe that's one of the hardest challenges that comes from Cohn's theology, that Cohn has a clear sense that there is a God of liberation that will mediate and bring about transformation in partnership with human agency. And one then has to ask the question as to whether that is realistic, or what evidence we are seeing that. Central to Cohn's work for me has always been his Christology. And so one of the things I want to explore in the next section is to talk about Cohn's Christology and its significance, both, again, not just for his work, but for the continuing Black liberation theology project that many of us, like myself and many colleagues in UNISA, are still committed to. For Cohn, the centrality of Christology and Jesus in Black theology rises from two sources. One source is the historic Black tradition into which Cohn was born, in which former enslaved peoples, seeing the hypocrisy of white Christianity, began to create their own ecclesial centers and find ways in which they could theologize and live out the Christian faith away from the prying eyes of white power. That's the first one. And then the second focus really comes from the biblical tradition itself. And so one of the key things that Cohn identifies as a central point of departure in talking about Jesus is the notion that Jesus was a colonized Jew. This is non-negotiable for Cohn, and I quote, Cohn says, the historical Jesus emphasizes the social context of Christology, and thereby establishes the importance of Jesus' racial identity. Jesus was a Jew. So the particularity of Jesus' person, as disclosed in his Jewishness, is indispensable for Christological analysis. End of quote. For Cohn, the fact that Jesus was not an Aryan, he was not a white man, is hugely significant, and that remains a central aspect of how Black theology conceives of a God of liberation as a God who has entered into human history through the particularity of one who was an oppressed subject of empire. For me, what I say in the book, going on further from Cohn, but thinking particularly of the context of my post-colonial reality in Britain, which in a interesting way probably links me more to South Africa than it does to America. Not necessarily in terms of South Africa being a Black majority African country, which Britain isn't, and in that regard, Cohn's experience in America would be more analogous to my own. But on the other hand, Cohn never really writes about empire and never really talks about post-colonial realities, because although America was an empire, it stopped being so in 1776. So there's no one currently in America who has a lived experience of what it was like to be part of a colonized empire, because America stopped being that a long time ago. But clearly what links the Black experience in Britain to the Black marginalised experience in South Africa is the nature of empire and the nature of white settler communities who come from Europe and settle in South Africa and then instigate the normality of white supremacy. And so central to my articulation or re-articulation of Cohn's work is to think about, it's about Jesus' encounter with Pontius Pilate. In John's account that leads up to Jesus' crucifixion. And so the paradox for me that in John 18 verses 28 and 40, we see Jesus in conversation with Pontius Pilate, a Roman governor of Judea. Jesus is before Pilate because he has been handed over by the Jewish authorities to be tried for crimes against the state. The fact that Jesus is here in front of Pilate is because, as the text states in verses 31 and 32, only Pilate can put him to death. And this underscores the type of death that Jesus would die, i.e. at the hands of an invading imperial power. In pointing out this particular encounter, one of the things I say in the book, again, drawing on Cohn's own analysis, but then going a little further than this, Cohn, as I said, doesn't explore this in any great detail, is the fact that the Christianity, certainly that I have been born into, i.e. a mission imperial Christianity that helped to shape empire, to help to shape places like South Africa and the island, Caribbean island of Jamaica, which is where my parents were born and brought up. And all those other parts of the globe that were once in pink to designate that they were part of the British Empire, the largest empire the world's ever seen, 24% of the world on which the sun never set at its height, is that Christianity owes more to Pontius Pilate than it does to Jesus. That when white Christians are thinking about our theological legacy, certainly those who have been born within the prism of empire, is the reality that Pontius Pilate is a colonial apparatchik. He is there to ensure that the writ of Rome, Pax Romana, that the power of Caesar is affected within that colony. So Pontius Pilate is the kind of colonial apparatchik who would have, if he'd been British, he would have been trained at Oxford, where I work, or in Cambridge, and would have been sent out by the Foreign Office in order to run the empire for the British and to be a representative of the monarch and to ensure that order is maintained within the colonies, and for religion and for Christianity to be the religion of empire that then dictates that overarching sense of control and the management of colonial bodies. Yet such has been the switch of Christianity post-Constantine, that most white people, and black and brown people as well, to be fair, don't realize this switch. And so when we see Christianity in all its imperial power, in all its power to maintain the status quo, that owes nothing to a Galilean Palestinian Jew who was a colonized person under empire, that owes everything to Pontius Pilate. And yet when you bring that up and you say, actually, our official religion owes more to empire and the brutalities of empire than it does to a marginalized, dispossessed figure, then white people then get upset with you. And actually some black and brown people also get upset as well, because they've internalized that. And for them, Christianity's relationship to power and order and control is very much part and parcel of the faith that they have inherited. And so one of the ongoing power of Cohn's work is the way in which he talks about when he talks about particularity, it's the way in which his work is focused on an understanding of Jesus's oppressed identity. He is the oppressed one. And Cohn says this. He says, and I quote, "The appearance of Jesus as the oppressed one, whose existence is identified exclusively with the oppressed of the land, is symbolically characterized in his birth." So the incarnation, the way in which Jesus is born, the social context in which he's born, Cohn says, speaks to the reality of his identity with those who are poor and marginalized in different contexts across the world. What is significant to Cohn's work, and I think this is one of the most significant challenges for many of our contemporary contexts, is Cohn's notion of ontological blackness. So Cohn's not a nationalist. So Cohn never says that God identifies with black people simply because people are black or African descent. No. Cohn says God identifies with people because they suffer. And because of their suffering, because of their oppression, because of the way in which his own life is a resistance, is a form of resistance to oppression. And ultimately, his liberating work finds expression in him dying on the cross, which is not simply for the atonement of human sin, but it's in solidarity with all those who continue to be oppressed, all those who continue to be crucified, all those who continue to be marginalized on contemporary crosses. So I'm in no doubt that if God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and is revealed in Jesus, who is where people are crucified and are suffering, then God is in Gaza at this moment. And the indictment for all those who unequivocally identify with Israel as if there is no agency or no presence of God's revelation within those who are marginalized and suffering the most, then I think that we are theologically incorrect. So therefore, one of the key things then that comes out of Cohn's identification of ontological blackness, i.e. that God is revealed through the nature of black suffering, a symbolic and actual identification with those who are marginalized and suffering, is that this is a conditional and contextual form of identification, i.e. that when those who are marginalized and oppressed then become the oppressors, God no longer sides with them. God's agency then switches sides and will then identify with others who are continued to be marginalized and oppressed. That is perhaps the most difficult idea that comes out of Cohn's theological legacy that people are still wrestling with, because it was much easier to identify a God of liberation if Cohn was working as a black nationalist and saying that basically God's identity with black people was simply on the basis of our historic identity as people in black skin, or in darker skin, if we want to see it in more political terms, i.e. people who are not white and people who have been involved in struggle. But Cohn says no. Cohn says in order to understand this as a theological motif, looking at the life of Jesus as the primary agent of God's interventionary powers into human history, one has to see that yes, Jesus is a colonized Jew, but he's a colonized Jew at a time when there is oppression both within and external through the Roman occupation. I don't believe for one moment that God's revelation in terms of identification with a group of people is now with the state of Israel, which is one of the most militarized powers in the world. It has a bigger army than Britain does and has resources that have been given to them largely by America that allow them to flout most of the UN rules. I do not believe for 1 second that they're on the side of God's righteousness. That's a hard question to ask, because certainly if I was doing this now within Britain and speaking to a British audience, I'm sure I would be booed, and some people would then accuse me of anti-Semitism. I think within the South African context, and I say this gently because I don't live there, I'm not a South African citizen, but I'll be interested in taking questions from some of you around. So therefore, if this ontological location of God in Christ, identifying with the oppressed, then the question is, where then does God then stand with a ANC black majority government that once was on the side of the marginalized and the oppressed in terms of its resistance to apartheid, but now has been in power for a number of years and has proved itself to be less of a revolutionary transformative agent for change and more of a normal political party based on nepotism and corruption. That's not to say that the ANC is any worse than, let's say, it's like the British Labour Party over here, or the Conservative Party in terms of how political parties operate. But I guess the question many of us have asked, and certainly I've asked, who used to march and campaign as a student almost 40 years ago in terms of anti-apartheid as an undergraduate in Birmingham, is that we always believed or hoped that the ANC would be a different type of party, not just another party, if and when they ever came to power. So the question then, I guess, that Cohn would pose and Cohn's legacy poses is, where is God's identification now? Is it with those who were once in opposition, once in exile, but now have their hands on the tiller of power, or has it changed? I believe it's changed. I believe that God's identification with the marginalized and the oppressed means that God's agency is not to be found in government offices in Cape Town and Johannesburg, but is to be found in shacks and in informal settlements and in former townships. That God's identification with the oppressed and the marginalized is not a static entity, which therefore reminds us that when we're doing theology in context, we have to be aware that contexts are not static. And so part of the danger, I think, of all forms of contextual theologies of liberation is the danger of assuming a reified existence. So we end up theologizing on the basis of history and memory, but not on the basis of contemporary experience. So let me give an example in our British context. So when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, one of the key things we made as a decision was to work with a political understanding of Black. So Black did not simply mean people of African descent, or people who had Black skin in terms of phenotypes who identified with our ancestors from the continent. Black actually was a coalition understanding of all peoples who were simply not white and were marginalized and were seen as other within the context of a white majority country that is Britain. The assumption back in the day was that most people, therefore, who were not white would be, broadly speaking, on the left, would be in favor of progressive politics and progressive change, and would be working with others in solidarity for transformative systemic change. Now, part of the skill of the Conservative Party has been their realization that whilst those on the left had a very high view of this sense of working together for a communal change, a systemic change, where we struggle together in solidarity, mainly through the trade union movement and through leftist groups, most notably with the British Labour Party, although that has not always been a particularly left party as such. What the Conservatives were able to do is simply to find those individuals who were ambitious for themselves, not for the greater good of the communities of which they were part, and to give them prominence, give them opportunities to progress very quickly as individuals, on the understanding that once they had progressed, what they would then do is to turn around and become effectively the mouthpieces for white supremacy and for post-imperialism and neocolonialism. So what you now have is a Conservative Party. It's far more diverse than the Labour Party. a party that has moved to the right but has many more Black and Asian people prominently. We have an Asian Prime Minister. And what they've shown is that actually diversity in and of itself and inclusivity is not the same as liberation. Cohn was very, very clear that one of the things he said in his work in terms of this notion of ontological blackness is that just because you're Black doesn't mean that you're necessarily on the side of the thrust for liberation. Black conservatives, or people of that conservative ilk, have always been able to internalize the tropes of empire and colonialism and to work hand in hand with white supremacy on the basis that so long as their own agency is enabled, the fact that that then attacks and demonizes most of the people who look like them is fine so long as they're okay. So one of the challenges in our context is that we have to rethink the old coalition politics of the 70s and 80s because it's now out of date. If the model for liberation was predicated upon people being Black and brown people working together, then how then do we then account for a Conservative Party whose front bench is largely made up of Black and brown people who are passing pernicious policies that are impacting upon ordinary poor people in Britain, but done by people who are not white, but people who look more like me and look more like most of us who are here in this Teams meeting. So therefore, as I come to the end of this talk, the key thing then for Black liberation theology is that it cannot be static. We can't work with a particular paradigm that says that, okay, whether it was the 1970s or 60s or 80s in terms of anti-apartheid, or whether in terms of it was the 70s or 80s in terms of coalition politics in Britain, we have to do theology in context and to update our thinking and to be always aware of the shifting politics and shifting power structures that mean that, as often said in Britain, that people who were once poachers now become gamekeepers, that people who were once on the outside and who were marginalized and oppressed now now have power in large offices and have official responsibility and then end up acting almost like the people who preceded them and who once oppressed them, and they now take on that similar guise and are oppressing others. So in conclusion, from all my reading of James Cone, and as I've tried to say in the book, Cone never saw his own work as static, and therefore he would not want people to romanticize or to eulogize his theology out of context. What he would want people to do is to learn from his insights, but then to apply them in a rigorous, analytical way to ask the questions of now and the challenges facing us now, rather than romanticize on what has been done in the past, no matter how laudable that work was. And so the challenge for South Africa is, how do you do Black theology in the 21st century with a Black majority government still pursuing neoliberal capitalist policies that are still best suited to help white supremacy, but are not best suited to help ordinary, marginalized, poor Black people in shanty towns and in informal settlements living under corrugated iron. In my context, what then does that mean to do theology in a context where we have an Asian Prime Minister, not a white one, and we have an Asian Home Secretary who's enacting policies that she herself admitted, if these things had been in place in the 1960s, her own parents would not be allowed to come into the country, and yet she pursues it nonetheless. A woman who has just said, and I quote, that anyone who is flying a Palestinian flag of support at this moment can be arrested for supporting terrorism. This is the same person who also then talks about freedom of speech and Britain being a bastion for freedom of conscience and freedom of expression. But if you fly a Palestinian flag, you run the risk of being arrested. Therefore, my final words are, we cannot romanticize James Cone. We can't romanticize his theology and fix it into, locate it purely within the period of Black power in the late 1960s. Yes, that's the context in which he writes, and we have to understand that context in order to understand the force of his work. But if we're going to be faithful to Cone and faithful to his legacy, then what we have to do is to update that theology and say, where is the risen Christ to be found now? Where is the nature of God's solidarity with the oppressed and the marginalized to be found now? Who are the contemporary pharaohs who believe that they have untrammeled power to dictate life and death upon other people? And let's not be fooled that sometimes those pharaohs look like us. Those pharaohs look like the people who were once marginalized and oppressed, but are now oppressing others. And therefore, let's continue to have the courage to speak truth to power. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Prof. A stirring recapitulation of the call of Cone and Cone's work to us today. So it's good for us to be together in this space. And I was looking down the list, and thankfully, or not thankfully, but surprisingly, most of you I know, so I can be more personal in my introduction to say thank you for joining us as friends, as colleagues, some of you as comrades, some of you as nihilists, some of you as deconstructionists, some of you as settlers, and even a few abazalwan. You are welcome. So it's good to be together to consider Prof's challenge to us and to discuss it. My name is Curtis Love. I'm a lecturer in theological ethics at the University of South Africa. And I'm grateful to be able to facilitate the question and response part of our program with my supervisor, Prof. Reddie. And there's lots I could say, but I will discipline myself to not do that, except to say thank you to Silaki, who really drove this process in the background and created the space for us to have this conversation today. So please feel free, if you prefer to type your question, you could just type it in the chat box. Otherwise, you can ask it by just unmuting yourself. And when you finish speaking, just remember to mute yourself. So yeah. In preparing for today, something that I found quite humorous was in the book, Prof, you reflect on the task of question and answer itself. And you recall your first encounter with Cone in 1996 at Queen's College. And how he dealt with what you call non-legitimate questions. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Prof. Reddie's writing, you'll find yourself laughing out loud at some of his descriptions and then sort of move to tears or anger. And this was one of them that I found quite funny, in which he describes essentially what we would call today 2 takedowns that Cone exercises against, one a black minister doing his PhD and the other a white principal at Queen's. And it's hilarious, so please make sure you read it. But I thought I would just read your description of non-legitimate questions. These usually commence with an insincere and fortuitous attempt to butter up the black speaker, and after a somewhat tortuous detour, affirming their agreement with the thrust of what he or she has said, comes the sucker punch. What then emerges is the real intent of the question. The real question starts with what I'm calling the magic but. Namely, after the flattery comes the but, after which the real point of the intervention is revealed. A very pointed question designed to accomplish two things. The superiority of the questioner as they seek to remind the audience that they are every bit as clever as the black speaker, and to remind the audience of the anomaly, indeed the very contradiction of the black speaker being equated with the status of an expert. So I found that amusing as I was preparing to facilitate, that there was such a powerful phenomenology of this very process. And I think all of us have been in situations where we've been the questioner or been questioned or observing it. And I thought it was a very profound description. Knowing you guys in the chat box, I can with some confidence say there will be limited non-legitimate questions today, Prof, but you can be the final judge of that. So let's open the floor, and please feel free to pose your questions. Just unmute yourself. Actually, if you could raise your hand, just so that we can acknowledge you, and then we'll take it from there. We have about 38 minutes, well, 35 minutes left. So please raise your hand or type a question in the chat box, and we will take it from there. Mr. Obakeng, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. So my name is Obakeng, and from the Department of Philosophy, Practical and Systematic Theology. And I am in the systematic theology discipline. So I just first want to express my appreciation for the presentation. It revealed to me how ignorant I've been of answers to questions that I'm busy asking now, imagining them to be innovative questions, and yet they've already been asked and, cogently answered, The reason I was so enamored by your presentation is for several reasons. One, its pertinence to my own research. Two, the way in which the chirological nature of what that your thoughts and your reflections. I mean, so to explain what I mean, and perhaps also wrap up, I see an interesting interaction between the question of theodicy and the politics of identity, and both those coming to a head in Cohn's Christology in a very interesting way. And the reason why I'm so enamored by that is because of the fact that two areas of critical reflection that I have been, particularly in this past week, thinking seriously about is the politics of identity and how it sometimes tends to, the politics of identity manifests itself in a negative way in terms of nationalism, and then also thinking about how then it comes together with the question of theodicy, where this group of people is brought together by the theodicy question, and one of the ways in which they then respond is through ethno-nationalism, and that then can result in some horrible theology and also horrible politics. So yeah, I was just very enriched by your presentation. So thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the very kind comments. I think what I would first say is, in deference to your own studies, is that there are no permanent answers to this, although it may look like you're posing questions to which there are already answers. They're not complete answers, they're only partial answers. And so your own research remains valid because you're writing about a context that is specific to you. And even if Cohn's ideas or my ideas or other people's ideas offer helpful insights, they don't answer the particularity of the challenges that you're posing in any absolute way. As I would say that really just to encourage you that don't think that your research somehow has been lessened because you've heard a presentation that looks like it's kind of answering all your questions. It doesn't answer your questions at all, I assure you. I think it offers a partial insight, but there are still ongoing challenges. That's the first question. I think the second question, and you're absolutely right about the relationship to identity and theology, because, and actually this is one of the challenges that is coming now, I think, for more traditional theologians who are pushing back against the nature of contextual theology. So although all theology is contextual, what we know is that any theology that has its context so tightly bound and has its identity of those who are seen as the elect, which is one of the things that Cohn talks about, that like the oppressed are the elect. But that's not a static category. And therefore, what we also need are theologies of transcendence and theologies that are challenging us also, not just to look at the context and to look at a fixed identity of one group of people, but also what is the broader question of how we live together within the broader body of Christ and with notions of our universality as human beings. I remember listening to a news item on South Africa, because obviously because of my link with the country, I try to follow as news items through the BBC World Service. And I believe that there's a new political party that's just started, that is a party that is fiercely against immigrants and is a party that is very much based upon, as you said, a kind of ethnocentric identity that wants to send immigrants home and effectively is trying to normalize xenophobia. And of course, this is the importance again of thinking of not of context as static, but allowing ourselves to see the fluidity of the changes in context and how that then throws up new challenges. Because what I find interesting is that one of my closest friends is Zimbabwean. And he lives in the UK and he has family in Zimbabwe, but he has family who are migrants in Joburg who are facing a lot of racism and xenophobia. And one point he says, but it's interesting that back in the day when South Africa was suffering from apartheid, we in Zimbabwe gave you freedom to come to our country. We gave you opportunities to be in exile. And even though it would have served us better to collude with the apartheid regimes, we did not do that. And so we suffered in order to be in solidarity with you. But 30, 40 years later, there's no solidarity with us, which is a reminder that we have to theologize critically at a particular moment and recognize how things have changed. And change is always for the best. Sometimes changes can be for the worst. So I would just encourage you that to continue to do your work, but don't feel intimidated by what's been written before. You are doing original work in your context now.
Thanks, Obakeng. Silake, please go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof, for the very engaging and stimulating presentation. A lot of the things you spoke about also sort of, are linked up to the sort of thing I'm also doing research on. So I have a question, maybe on a slightly technical note that I'd be very interested in hearing your response to. It will probably help me out. So, and for a little bit of background, without being, too long-winded, without being long-winded at all. So the Cone book I've probably given the most attention to is his second book, and what I sort of find when I read there, I see how he draws on figures like Paul Tillich and in many ways trying to sort of, maybe this is my own, maybe I'm projecting my sense of what's going on, but it seems like whatever else is going on, one of the things he's doing is sort of trying to get beyond a particular Barthian thing. And the Barthian thing in particular that I'm wondering if he gets beyond is that Barth's dialectical sense of, this gap between God in eternity and history. I wonder if Cone would you say Cone does succeed in getting beyond that, and or whether he doesn't? And if he doesn't succeed in getting beyond that, would you say that's a bad thing? Because I'm also aware that Dolores Williams does at some point in her critique of him, I believe, critique also that notion that Cone has, that God has reconciled the world and has reconciled us to each other, but why hasn't anybody told the white people? And she's sort of critical of the notion that God has reconciled us to, meaning her critique gives me the sense that she thinks Cone hasn't overcome that sort of Barthian dialectical thing. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, well, I think you make a very accurate appraisal of Cone's ongoing challenge, and I would probably even say Cone's perennial weakness. I think what's interesting about his second book, and for those who don't know, can I you mention the title? That is his book called A Black Theology of Liberation. And what's interesting in that is that Cone, I think, kind of shows his colours, that he's essentially a systematic theologian who is a neo-Barthian. So he's using the white Western intellectual tradition as the framework for him to create his particular version of Black liberation theology, which then gets him critiqued by his own brother called Cecil Cone. So Cecil Cone writes a book called A Crisis in Black Theology, where he takes Cone to task for being too European and too white, and says basically like the only black thing about Cone's Black theology is his own black skin and drawing upon black story, but his method is entirely white, which obviously galvanized Cone, because that's nothing like sibling rivalry, and so Cone's response then is to draw upon black sources to write the spirituals and the blues. But what's interesting, and you're quite right about, does Cone ever get beyond his kind of neo-Barthian? I don't think he ever does, in that he writes the spirituals and the blues to prove that he can use black sources. But that book is an anomaly. He never writes another book like that again. And therefore, his next book, 3 years later, is God of the Oppressed, which is just a bigger version of A Black Theology of Liberation using the same Barthian methods. So in answer to your question, first question, does Cone ever get beyond it? No, he doesn't. That is a continued weakness, I think. Although I understand it, because I think what Cone is trying to do, and I think a way of understanding his allegiance to the method is to read his last book, which is Said I Wasn't Going to Tell Nobody, which is his kind of final memoir. And really what he says is, he says in that his use of Barth and Tillich, but particularly Barth, is partly of his own training. His own PhDs on Barth, is on Barth anthropology. But also, I think it's a tactical way of trying to ensure that Black theology remains within the heartland of Christian theological work at a time when he wrote A Black Theology of Liberation. Some of his more liberal critics, white critics, were willing to concede that he had made a useful move, but wanted to push it the work into sociology or anthropology to say, well, you know, I mean, we can see what you're doing there, James, and it's interesting, but it's not really proper theology. And so his way of ensuring that it remains rooted in proper theology is to use the methods and the tools that white people themselves have created. Now, here's the thing. The famous quote from Spivak, can you dismantle the slave masters? Oh, no. Actually, I'll say Spivak, actually, it's not Spivak. Anyway, it's Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde's great quote is, can you dismantle the slave master's house using the slave master's tools? And most post-colonial scholars or decolonial scholars will say, no, you can't. And therein lies, I think, the perennial weakness of Cohn's work. Does it matter? I think it does and it doesn't. So I think it's an interesting dialectical question itself. And I think for your own research, you will have to come to your own view on this. In one sense, it does matter because what it does is it circumscribes the agency of Black theology within the prism of a form of Christian traditionalism. So one thing Cohn never deals with African religions. He never deals with indigenous thought. His work is still working within those white frameworks, which then begs the question, can you create a truly liberative theological movement using tools that are coming from your oppressor? That I think is a very fair question. I'm not saying it devalues Cohn's work absolutely, but it is a weakness. And I think it's good that you've spotted that. And the womanists are better because they're not as wedded to this particular framework as Cohn is. And so I think Dolores Williams' critique of Cohn, and particularly his critique of the cross, and although Cohn claims that he's not valorizing the cross and he's not spiritualizing it in terms of thinking of it as the mechanism for reconciliation, she says that basically we're not reconciled because we can't be reconciled through the nature of brutal torture. That is the cross, that is an agent of oppressive powers and imperialism. So she rejects Cohn's notion of a reconciliation that comes through that. But her own project is not without its own problems as well, of course. But I think you're right in that what is at stake is the extent to which is something I try to draw out in the book. If we're trying to learn from Cohn and be inspired by him, that's one thing, which is what I'm trying to do. But if we're trying to simply verify him because he said this and therefore we feel compelled to follow his move almost identically, then I think we're making a mistake because Cohn himself recognized like the limitations of his own work, even in the time in which he was doing it.
Thanks, Delake. Thandi, and then Masilo, I'll read your question after Thandi, but if you need to clarify anything, I'll invite you to do that. So please go ahead, Thandi.
Cool. Thanks so much, Curtis. And thank you so much for, such an incredible talk. Lots of things to think about. So my question might show up my limited knowledge of Cohn, but just wanted to engage with some of the things that you spoke about in response to Oba King's question. And particularly, I think the idea of the tension between the commitment to context and the particularities of context and the idea that there are no permanent answers, but held in tension with that idea that you talked about of having a transcendent vision for how we live together. I feel like that tension is so important and something that we often, I think our social movements don't necessarily know how to hold. And I think we don't necessarily always have a transcendent guiding vision that we're trying to get towards. And I think that with that vision, our actions could be the same with or without that vision, but somehow the orientation towards such a vision, I think, guides a lot of that process. And so I'm wondering if James Cone had such an articulated vision of the kind of world that he hoped that this would get us towards.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a really, really good question, because it points up to the ongoing challenges of doing liberationist forms of Christian theology, where we are trying to hold in tension the promises of eternity and the contextuality of our particular lived existence at a particular moment in time. Cone's sense of what was a transcendent vision as a Christian theologian would be the kingdom of God. So his sense of what would be the idealized set of social relations will be informed by Martin Luther King's notion of the beloved community, but would also be a kind of a distinctly eschatological understanding that in the end times, when God folds up human history into God's time, that essentially these perfect set of relationships will be expressed and realized within God's economy. But the challenge, of course, for Cone and for all social theologians, and myself included, is that, of course, like, we're not God. So, and so we are working with the temporality of our particular moment of trying to affect what we think the kingdom would look like within the messiness of our everyday existence, and trying to put theological and spiritual ideas into the mechanics of policy and systems and procedures, and sometimes within our democracies, kind of so what sort of legislations then do we have? And that is never perfect. It's never a perfect mapping of one thing onto the other, because for a start, we can only live our lives in one direction. So I think it's Paul Tillich who says that life is lived forwards, but understood backwards. And so when we're living it forwards, trying to imagine what we think is the right thing to do, we know that we will be judged by history. People will look back on our work and see the imperfections that we did not see at the time. I think if there's one thing I learned from Cone, and I think Cone himself would have recognized this certainly towards the end of his life, when he thinks back to his first writings in the 60s, where he's looking at the Black Power movement as being an expression of God's kingdom in terms of the radicality of speaking truth to power and challenging white supremacy. But of course, when we look back at that, what we see now is chauvinism, patriarchy, sexism, a limited gaze in terms of, even as they understood what the Black liberation movement looked like, it was a heteropatriarchal movement. So, so Cone doesn't recognize that at the time. Looking back 40 years, 50 years later, he can see that he can see the limitations of it. And so I think if the experience of South Africa and the effect to end apartheid tells us anything, is this: that the struggle for transcendence is not fixed on events, it's an ongoing process. That the moment we try to, what some scholars call historical projects, which is where we have in our minds concrete material forms of change that we are trying to affect. So obviously within South Africa, when I was doing my undergraduate studies and first got introduced to Black theology in South Africa, the transcendent hope for the future was to end apartheid. And whilst I understood all the writers and the work they were doing at the time, what we have also been reminded of is that human projects, as good as they are often realized, they are only an indication of what the fullness of of God's kingdom will look like, but they're never the totality. And so there has to be an ongoing process, because what has been shown in your context is that apartheid has ended, but the kingdom hasn't been realized. And therefore there has to be an ongoing set of projects. So put another way, scholars are now talking about using the theological language of pilgrimage. And the thing about a pilgrimage is, it's the journey itself that is more important than sort of trying to get to the destination. Because the truth is, like you're probably not going to get to the destination, but actually it's what happens in the movement of the journey and the realization that all the moments we're in are temporary moments and they're not fixed moments, and we therefore can't put down theological markers to say, well, now that we've accomplished this is a sign of the kingdom. No, it may be a temporary sign of it, but it's not the fullness of it. I hope that's not too confused and you were able to follow what I was saying.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tandy. And Prof, we have some friends from the Anabaptist Network in South Africa who are really pioneering this idea of theology as pilgrimage. So I'm very grateful that you highlighted that. So thank you. Masilo said, there's a strong notion that, especially from theologians from the South, that African theology is different from liberation theology, or maybe in this case, Black theology, and that the two theories need not be merged or approached equally, while others believe that they are complementing each other. So obviously a long historical debate between Black and African theology. Any comments on that, Prof? Masilo, have I represented you okay?
Yeah, I mean, and you asked about this, is an ongoing debate, ongoing conversation, contestation. I tend to see them as Black theology and African theology as different sides of the same coin. So there is an overall totality that they share, but they are not the same sides of the coin. So they're not the same things, but they are not disconnected. I think that's where I would look at it. And so in brief, what I would say is this, that what they share is a commitment to displacing whiteness and to displace white Euro-American hegemony. That's what they share in common. So whether it's African theologies, and I prefer to talk about African theology rather than African theology singular, but African theologies that are asserting the importance of indigeneity, of a reclaiming of African cultures, plural, a affirmation or maybe finding an accommodation with African religions, traditional African religions, whether one is looking at the kind of Christianity that comes out of African initiated churches. All those things are not necessarily Black theology. Some of them are, but a lot are not. But what they're all doing is that they are decentering and displacing, hopefully, whiteness and the centrality of white norms as being universal, and therefore they should predominate in every context, even in a continent that has its own histories and traditions that are older than, let's say, white European traditions. Where they're not the same things, clearly, is that there is an explicit liberationist approach to Black theology, which at its best critiques hierarchy, critiques existing social norms, particularly if they are marginalizing individuals who are at the edges of their respective communities and are not seen as normative or normal. And obviously there are elements of African theologies, and I say elements of because it's a plural movement, that would reinforce notions of sort of traditional teachings, especially around hierarchies, particularly around notions of, I guess, royal families and lineages and aspects of patriarchy, even though I know that, again, Africa being such a broad continent with lots of traditions, there are elements that are matriarchal and not patriarchal. But certainly insofar as some aspects of African theology want to reclaim and restate notions of African traditions, what I would say is that no tradition is beyond critique, and no tradition is perfect in itself, no matter how old it is or where it comes from. And so Black theology would be more able to be more critical of and challenge some of those existing norms. But at the same point, the weakness of Black theology, as defined earlier with Cohn, is sometimes it's more that sometimes it draws from whiteness and white traditions more often than it really wants to admit. So, for example, quite a lot of Black theology, even like the Black theology in Southern Africa, was informed a lot by Marxism. But Marxism, that's not an African idea. Marx himself was a white European Jew. So, therefore, the challenge that Black theology wrestles with is what are its sources and norms, and how are they really compatible with an African self, in ways that African theology would push Black theology to say, how Black and African really are you? But the Black theology side of the coin would say, but how much are you really critiquing and trying to change existing traditions? Just because something exists before Europeans came doesn't always make it good. So I don't necessarily see them in opposition. I see them, well, for me personally, others would disagree, but I see them as being different sides of the same coin.
Thanks, Prof, for that image as a way of respecting difference, but also sort of recognizing the unity between those two projects. We probably have time for one more question. We have Quibus. I'm going to ask to pose his question now, and then there may be time for one after that. Let's see how that goes. Go, Quibus, please.
Probably brief.
Thank you very much, Curtis. Anthony, thanks. It's been a real joy to listen to you. Just to say, I think when you introduced the question of God's agency, you really stepped into our debates and the debates that we kind of been having around our corridors and our cafeteria. So thanks for that. And I hope it's a conversation that will continue, even beyond this lecture. But I think what we're grappling with, and you already touched on the historical significance of where we are, but it's these moments of, and I have these four moments that's emerging not only from me but from our conversation. So Basil Moore actually introduces Harvey Cox into Black consciousness in South Africa, and it really doesn't get any traction at all. So that's kind of the one moment. Biko responds. I mean, not to that, but when he says, God isn't in the business of coming down and fixing things. We kind of have to do it. So it's God's agency, but it's working through humans. People actually have to act. But then in the 80s, Albert Nolan's God in South Africa really kind of tying up the Liberation Project completely with a future South African state. I mean, in a way that in many ways is a theological embarrassment. In the extent to which he goes, and then the fourth moment, Takatu Mafeking responding in the early 90s and saying, well, there's a generation that is just lost. What we're doing here historically is not going to benefit them at all. And it's that moment of saying, but how do we deal with the fact that there's suffering and there's people suffering, and not historically it's not going to change in their lifetime? And then talk about agency. For me, it's a question of discernment almost. And that's what where I want to head with this, is what's the contours kind of post-Cohn and where, post Dolores Williams and where we are now, what's the contours of that practice of discerning, so where is God? Because that for me is really the thing that I think we need to grapple with. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And very, very quickly, because I think you set it out so well that there's no point in me sort of reiterating that. I think one of the fundamental weaknesses of the movement that Cohn helped to initiate was that it was a top-down one. So for all the talk of doing the theology of liberation, Cohn and Williams and others never really did theology with people on the ground. And so one of the things I've tried to do, I mean, how well I've done it, that's for the people to judge. But I know within the South African context, is finding ways of doing theology with people in the midst of their messiness, because actually doing theology, let's say, in a township is very different from doing it in a seminar room at Union Theological Seminary. And therefore, how we find ways of doing theology that take into account the fact that part of the scarring of poverty and oppression is that ordinary people sometimes will internalize the very, very tropes and ideas that have been inimical to their own freedom. But actually, you have to take that on board and meet that head on rather than trying to ignore it. And so that sense of nihilism then that often pervades those communities are things that we have to build into our theological work. So I don't have any great answers to that, Cobus, except I think that the methodology of how we do theology has to change, and it has to be one that is more dialogical and engages in a true contextual theology that works from the bottom up, not the top down.
Thanks, Cobus and Prof. And like any great educator, like any great preacher, you have left us hungry. And Cobus has posed, I think, the nub of the conversation we want to continue having with you. And the good news, friends, is that Prof will be joining us next year. And we're trying to design a time in which we can really, engage and listen. We don't want to just fly Prof in and have a public lecture and send him on his way. We want to try and grapple with what is God up to now, and what is our sort of response to that. And so if you feel dissatisfied that there's things you wanted to engage on more, this is a very early invitation, and you'll be hearing more from us around that next year. We're going to end here now, Prof, and I'd like to ask the chair of our department, Prof. Lapacha, if he wouldn't mind just closing off our session today.
Okay, thanks, Curtis. Perhaps let me just greet Professor Anthony Reddie. And of course, I would start by apologizing for not being here when you started. I was just moving in between meetings, yeah, so I just came in on your last bite. But having said that, let me just take this opportunity to thank you, Professor Reddie, for always availing yourself. And of course, for always delivering thought-provoking papers. I mean, I was not there, but I know for a fact that every time I have an engagement with you or listening to you presenting, I know all your presentations are thought-provoking. And as such, we want to thank you very much. So that I think we should not forget. And I think in your last bite, when you're talking about the critique itself, at times I think we tend to forget. I think Professor Mufokeng always reminds us to say, never forget the theology itself should be from the experience. And then I think you were saying the Black experience should be the starting point, rather than doing theology from the ivory tower. So, and I know that's always your point. So thank you very much for availing yourself, and also for this paper. And we're looking forward for these engagements even more. Perhaps visiting us for some time. So that we have classes and all that, but we will have that engagement. So in short, thank you very much, Prof.
Thanks, Prof. Lapacha. Prof. Reddie, any closing words, and then we will release people.
Well, simply to say that it's always a great honor to engage with my friends and family at uni. So one of the things I think I shared with you quite recently when we met in Birmingham is that as much as I enjoy all the hoopla that comes from my professorship in Oxford, I'm always mindful that I was a professor already, and that was courtesy of UNISA. And long before it was politically expedient to make me a professor, you had already done so. And so for me, being a professor in a university that has a long history of commitment to Black liberation struggle means everything to me, and actually probably for the discipline probably symbolically means more than just being a professor in Oxford, which is still a place of white privilege.
Thanks, Prof. And yeah. All the best to everyone. Please join me in giving Prof a round of applause, and we will be in touch around future plans.